episode number 2. Today we're going to explore some of the ancient roots of the Eucharist. I want to start though by having you imagine people having a meal together, whatever image comes first into your mind. The chances are that image was an image of people sitting together at a table with a chair and many chairs all around it. Now I want you to imagine Jesus and his friends gathered for a meal. My guess is a slideshow of Christian art from across the ages flipped through your mind. And in every single one of those pieces of art that I know of, Jesus and his friends are sitting at a table sort of like this and chairs sort of like this. When the reality is, that wasn't normal for common people in Europe until after the Middle Ages. The complication is that most of the people in the history of the world, they didn't eat meals sitting in chairs or stools or benches, and millions of people still don't. And all of that art that you think of, well, it was paid for by very elite people, and their style and manner of eating was what was depicted in the artistry and of the era in which they lived, none of which were the era where Jesus lived or of the style of life in which Jesus and his companions were living. So, Jesus, our middle-class at best, itinerant preacher, in a time when most homes were small and practical, well, a whole lot of the imagery we have coursing through our brains might get in the way of our imagining the ancient roots of Holy Communion, the Eucharist, the great Thanksgiving. So, let's start with the furniture. So if Jesus didn't typically eat at a high table and chairs, how did they eat? Like I said, probably like a picnic. Sometimes you have to think of it as something that modern designers might call bohemian. It also may help you to remember some of the ways in which traditional Japanese and Chinese dining is done, usually with low tables and cushions near those tables. Now, in Jesus' era, however, in the Mediterranean region, there was a strict social caste system, and where you sat at a meal was dependent upon where you sat in that system. So, there would be, if it was a formal dining room in a wealthy person's house that was established as a room to eat, it would have stages. It would actually have levels, sort of like our nave does. And the most highly esteemed, wealthiest, powerful people would be up here, sitting high at a meal, and those of lowest esteem would be sitting down low. Now, sitting is also an issue. The most esteemed people would be lounging, sort of like in a chaise lounge. You've seen some of that imagery in movies about Egypt and about Rome. The seating posture of the privileged in Jesus' era was lounging in a lounge chair up high. And sitting at a table was actually a slight. It was womanish. It was something that lower people did. And by sitting at a table, I still mean probably sitting on a cushion up against a table like this, lower to the ground. On the night before he died, Jesus and his friends, they were in a borrowed guest room that was above the main house. What was on the tables that he shared with his friends in this farewell meal? The farewell meal that a lot of people call the Last Supper. I tend to avoid calling it that because he eats again after the resurrection. I really like the Eastern Orthodox approach of referring to it as the mystical supper. But regardless, the farewell meal, what did he share? Now, it depends on how much you invest in the Passover connection. It could have been unleavened bread, what we would think of as matzah, or it could have been an everyday bread, maybe a flat bread, or maybe a risen bread. Both are possible. All are possible. But most likely probably wasn't as pale as this. It would be much more of what we would think of as a hearty whole grain. Now, as for the wine, a few weeks ago, I was so excited to walk into a store and discover this wine. This is a wild wine, and it's in this clear bottle, which really helps us out today. So, now, admittedly, the wine at Jesus' table would not be in a glass, and amongst Jewish people would not have a pig pictured on it. However, this wine is much closer to what would have been on Jesus' table. In a glass, it might look something like this. It's not as clear as wine we're used to. It was probably foamier than most wine that we're used to. The world is made to ferment. It took modern science to figure out how to temporarily keep fermentation away so that we can put things on shelves like grape juice and apple juice. In Jesus' era, this wouldn't be called a wild wine, it would be called a wine. The reason it's called a wild wine now is because the artists who make it, they let the yeast that are on the grapes be the source of the fermentation chemical reaction that happens to make this wine. So in typical wine processing nowadays, they wash all of everything off of the grapes they possibly can and then carefully add cultivated yeast into the winemaking process. This is wild yeast. It's just like the ancients would have done. You put fruit out, yeast gets on it, you crush the fruit, the yeast is there, the sugars are there, the carbohydrates are there, and fermentation happens. So, what would have been on Jesus' table? Something that looks a lot more like this cloudy, foamy beverage. Now, the wine is really important to talk about. Ancient wines were usually unfiltered, and what was served on the table would have had a low alcohol content because it wasn't so much a party beverage as much as it was kind of like a water treatment plant. When wine was served at a table, it was usually served in a ratio of usually about a quarter wine at an everyday time and 1/4 wine, 3/4 water. At a fancy occasion, that ratio would be raised a little bit, but it still wouldn't be more than half. The reason why they do that is because the alcohol kills some of the waterborne illnesses in the water. It actually makes the water safer to drink. Something else we know is that ancient wines actually provided some health benefits that we wouldn't be able to get from just eating raw grapes alone. And then the last thing to mention about ancient wines was that many households typically were fermenting something. It may have been grapes, it may have been whatever fruit showed up, it may have been whatever ferments. You put wild honey and water together and let it sit, it's going to ferment. A fermented beverage, like wine, was so critical to well-being that nearly every household was practicing some sort of fermentation for their well-being and the well-being of their guests. The adding of water to wine, like we do on the Eucharistic table, it's actually sort of backwards. It's almost more like in the ancient way they would have added wine to the water. And it's taken on lots of symbolic meaning over the history of Christian practice, but in the beginning, it was simply the way they did it, a life-giving ancient table practice. The oldest biblical source for the Eucharist, it comes from the first letter to the Corinthians. I received a tradition from the Lord, which I also handed on to you. On the night on which he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread. If you're familiar with our Eucharistic liturgy, you've heard a variation on this very phrase. It's 2 verses in this letter of Paul to the Corinthians. The letters of Paul to the Corinthians are older than the Gospels, but the Gospels are telling us a story about an earlier time. That said, the Gospels are older. 3 of the Gospels relate very similar, what we would call institutions of the Eucharist, beginnings of the Eucharist, but they all have their own peculiarities. And we're going to show you some of these texts. The things I want to point out between Mark and Matthew and Luke is some of them have some different phrasing. And then you might notice that in Luke, the wine is shared before the bread. In the Gospel of John, we don't have a similar account in a direct way, but we do have two critical features of the entire Gospel of John that are important for thinking about the biblical roots of the Eucharist. First is that the farewell teaching and meal are at the very center of the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is very built into circular logic. So what's at the center is at the center. It's really important. And then secondly is that the bread of life discourse, which starts in John 6 and says things like, where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty, has so many allusions to what we know from the other Gospels and from 1 Corinthians of this farewell meal, that it most certainly is alluding to that practice and weaving the theology of that practice into the whole story of who Jesus is and what he means to us. One of the other differences is about this farewell meal's relationship to the Passover. In John, the Passover begins after Jesus dies, whereas in the other three Gospels, it is named as a meal at Passover, which brings up some really difficult quandaries. What do we know about Passover at the time of Jesus? The answer to that question is almost nothing. Nearly bupkis. The oldest documentation about the ancient Passover is the New Testament. So what happened at ancient Jewish Passover meals? We don't really know. The next substantial reference is in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And then the oldest complete Haggadah. A Haggadah is the prayer book of a modern Passover supper. The oldest Haggadah that's complete goes back to around 1000. There are references in the same time at which Rabbinic Judaism is really taking its almost current shape in the 600s, but the reality is we really do not know what the ancient Passover was like. Yet for all that we don't know, there is something about the modern Passover tradition, which is the only one I have any acquaintance with. If it has any resemblance with what the ancient people, the ancient Jews, what Jesus' community did, to me it helps make sense of what Jesus says at this meal. In the modern Passover meal, there are all these symbolic foods. For example, there are bitter herbs, and you take the bitter herb and you dip it in salt water. And the remembrance is about the bitterness of slavery and the tears that were cried that God heard. And you eat that bitter herb dipped in those salty tears, and you become one with the people who were enslaved in Egypt, who God heard the cries of, who God liberated. That idea, eat this food that is a metaphor and a memorial, that's dangerous language when talking about the Eucharist, a metaphor for an experience of a people. And the idea that you eat that food ritually and you become one with these ancient people, it sounds a whole lot like when Jesus says, eat this, remember it as my body, and together we will be. Exodus theology that this meal is somehow connected to our liberation from evil, that it's connected to the waters of baptism. It flows all through our practice and theologies of Eucharist. But we also have to remember that the relationship with the ancient Passover is a tremendously sensitive unknown. Religious borrowing and copying has always existed. Maybe they were sort of parallel developments. Some scholars think that Passover began as a blend of two West Asian traditions that gained a Yahwehist, so the God of the I am who I am, the God of the Hebrew people. Two West Asian traditions that gained a Yahwehist meaning over time. What's more agreed on is that it wasn't established biblically until the Second Temple era, so after the Babylonian exile. What it was in the time of Jesus was probably a little bit more, and stick with me for a second, a little bit more like the Super Bowl. By which I mean that there were normative foods and normative dress and postures at homes. Think about it. We have normal food and normal things people wear and normal ways that people sit at a Super Bowl party that create a sense of unity with each other and unity with the culture, while also being centered on a core activity that's happening at a specific central building, a special central building. So the relationship with what we think we might know about the ancient Passover, there were home practices, but they were the emphasis around Passover wasn't what was going on in the home, it was what was going on at the temple. And what was going on at the home was a connection to and a celebration of what was going on at that temple, at the best that we know. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So Passover is important to the biblical roots of communion, but so too are all of the stories of people being challenged and healed and transformed by feasting together in times of difficulty, both in the Old and in the New Testaments. Perhaps the ancient roots of the Eucharist are simply how we are made. Elaborate ceremonial meals foster meaning and unity, and that is a worldwide cross-cultural phenomenon. We have much better historical evidence for how early Christians practiced what Jesus commanded. Scholars are fairly certain that the commonality of the biblical text shows a fairly common Christian practice amongst the early Jesus movement. So much so that by the time of Paul's ministry in the mid-1st century, it reflects what other communities are doing as reflected in the Gospels. The next critical description is in what's known as the Didache, and you can look that up. We're going to provide the link here in this video. It's basically a church instruction book, and it's from the early 100s, and it's interesting. One of the differences is that, like Luke, the wine is shared before the bread. Then in the 150s, we have an early church explainer. Usually those are called apologists. That's what an apologist means. It means an explainer. Early church explainer Justin Martyr is how he's known. Justin is a Samaritan Christian who was later martyred in Rome. In his writings, he describes how the churches that he was familiar with practiced communion. And interestingly, one of the differences is that the lessons are shared after the bread and the wine. And then we have the mysterious Hippolytus. Hippolytus and his extensive writings come from the 200s. And the reason I say he's mysterious is we don't know where he was from or what community he was a part of. And even the earliest references to his writings, they don't know where he's from or who he was writing to either. One of these documents we do call the Apostolic Tradition. And in the Apostolic Tradition, you have an ancient manual for churches, for the orders of ministry, for bishops and priests and deacons, and how they're ordained. You have instructions for how baptism happens, how Eucharist is practiced. And one of my favorite differences being some of the things I have here on this table, so that at the table, fruits are blessed, and olives are blessed, and cheeses are blessed, and a honey milk mixture is also blessed at the table, so that it looks a lot more like the offerings of our lives present on this table, and it's also much more of a much more of a meal together. So to review what we've talked about, Jesus and his friends shared a life-changing farewell meal in the context of the Passover celebrations. And Scripture both commands and demonstrates that the early Christians did this and that he has invited us to do this until we join him forever in eternity. How they ate that mystical supper, what they ate, those are not what we usually use, and also not how it's always depicted, and also not how I typically eat. At its roots, the Eucharist has a connection with the ancient Jewish Passover festival, but we really don't know much about that. And it seems that the earliest Christian communities practiced this commanded meal and prayer and teaching, and that it may have had significant uniformity. Next week, we're going to move ahead in time really quickly. We're going to look at the Eucharistic practice and how it evolved as the church merged with the empire. And then we're going to survey the differences raised in the Reformation's eras. There were multiple Reformations and there were multiple eras of these Reformations. And then we'll glimpse how the renovations emerging from what we call the liturgical sciences, the renovations emerging from the mid-20th century, how it changed Eucharistic practice as well. An example would be right here when we brought this table out from the back wall and put it more in the center of our life together. So my invitation to you until next time is to ponder what ritual meals in our society foster connectedness and what are the rituals around them. And then I have an assignment for you. Make a list. Make a list of the times that Jesus breaks bread in all of the Gospels. It's a lot. Thank you for joining me here today for Taste and See, episode 2. I hope you'll join us next week. Be at peace and be so much more than kind.